Absolutely. Absolutely. Javier, I hope you're well. I'd be curious what anyone at all has been thinking about. I can tell you what I've been doing, which has been a very, very long deep dive on Jordan Peterson, comparing him with Paul Tillich, because I think he's basically just Tillich and mixed with mythology. He's an existential theologist. And I'm trying to compare that with, Cadell in Real Speculations warns about the need to move from religion to absolute knowing and what are the costs of that. And also, I'm extremely interested. We don't have to talk about this at all, but I'm just telling you what I've been doing and really comparing how Peterson talks about particularly Noah, Moses, and Jonah. I think those are extremely important to understand his thinking. So I've been doing that, but I'm curious about anything at all for anyone.
I'll just comment on what you're saying. I think the difference between an existential mythologist is they just analyze story versus creating story.
Mm.
And the move basically it's the same shit. It's the same shit that we've been talking about basically, which is the real move to get to speculative reasoning is I think the creative side, not the analyzing side, which is essentially just to tie it to the whole virtue ethics psychoanalysis debate, because I think they go hand in hand here. It's that they're both there. They're both very legitimate things, but it's an emphasis issue. The emphasis needs to be on the virtue ethics because, in that sense, you're creating, which affords the ability to psychoanalyze. Um, it's same thing with this Jordan Peterson thing. If you're just being an existential mythologist, you're essentially just doing a form of psychoanalytic. You're part of that side of the spectrum versus the act of creating, which um, basically affords the ability to look at an unfolding in terms of possibility. And in that sense, you destroy hierarchy in a certain way. Hierarchy isn't the primacy, which is I know what Jordan Peterson is keen on, that there's a certain hierarchy. Even though like Heidegger will talk about there's a hierarchy in questioning, like rereading Intro to Metaphysics, he talks about basically why is there being versus no being at all is the highest question, even though it's not necessarily the most uh, evident question to ask right away. He really talks about that paradox where it's like the least obvious, but once you get there and you ask the question, it's always going to be a question looming in the background of your thought. It's going to always be um, basically when you're creating thought, it's the it's the reference point for all thought that you're having when you're creating or discovering thought. So I would just say psychoanalysis or existential mythology, even though they are different things. Them being within the same part of the spectrum, the same dimension, so to speak, is essentially um, it's 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 not. I would say it doesn't have the question that Heidegger's talking about being in the foreground of the creative act, whether it be thought or action. That would probably be my main distinction between the two, where like virtue ethics, it requires that question to be in the forefront of the creative act, thought, etc. But the thing is, once you're undertaking this creative act, it only is natural to then get into a mode of analysis once the act has once the act is after the fact, essentially. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to just paint out the landscape with how I see it, and basically the Heideggerian question, which comes from Leibniz, really, basically is what allows that distinction to make sense to me. Because once you're doing analysis, you're not necessarily, it's already subsumed in the act of analysis, that question of why is there beings versus no beings at all. And you're already in a particular mode where basically it's already presumed simply because you're already operating under the gap and like how that gap is there in the first place, which is essentially the second question to why is there beings versus no beings at all. Yeah, but
Nice.
I'll pass it off.
No, I love it. I'll give it to Jockin and Javier and Dimitri. It is good to see you. Well, it's very interesting. So, in a way, there's a difference between the analysis before giving yourself over to a story and the analysis that naturally follows from giving yourself over to a story. I think that's very interesting. So, the question between, because when I read Tillich, so first off, I should say that I went through a phase of really reading everything Paul Tillich did, really working on Paul Tillich, Dynamics of Faith, Courage to Be, his entire systematic theology. I found it very, very fascinating and very, very useful and also very, very important. And then I found out that Paul Tillich was a womanizer. He would fondle students and was actually a very terrible human being. Such to the point that it devastated Richard Niebuhr. Like Niebuhr really pushed to have Tillich added to the theological union that he was part of. And he sent a student to go visit Tillich to get advice and found out later that he abused her. And this always blew my mind because then the question was, wait a minute, what is it in Paul Tillich that actually led to this? And clearly, here's the key. Paul Tillich thought it was actually somehow acceptable within his theology. Because this was not, like what's very interesting about the Tillich womanizing is that this was not a sort of secret. This was like celebrated. It was almost like a gift of grace to kind of be able to participate in this thing. It's very odd, right? Now, Cadell has emphasized that the stakes of the movement from religion to absolute knowing is the sublation or confronting of libido, right? And that if you don't actually work with libido, there's going to be something you're not dealing with that will either come out in the form of, well, sexual problems or violence, right? And we've also had a talk between the differences where anger is not innately bad, but there's a point where maybe we can say it becomes rage, and then it becomes destructive, which of course these are the stakes of, we talk all the time about the stakes of global pluralism blowing up into World War III. And like Mr. Jockin said, is pack it up. Pack it frickin' up, man. If we can't separate the good and the beautiful, just pack it up. We're done. It's going to go to violence, right? And so part of the idea, as Cadell is putting forth and that we've talked about, is if we can't think the move from religion to absolute knowing in Hegel, which another way to just put absolute knowing quite simply is basically the acknowledgement of lack. Now, there's more to it, of course, because then this is the beginning of the science of logic, as we've talked about, not the end. It is the end of a phenomenology that opens up speculative reason. So it's very, and also critically, the phenomenology is an always already. Like spirit has already moved from that. But when we talk about, say, a Peterson or a Tillich not moving from religion to absolute knowing, it's a failure to realize what is always already. And that's always that tricky move, right? And one of the reasons it's pathological, you could say, if you don't make that move, is because it's already the case, but you're acting as if it's not. And that disconnect is what creates problem, right? So this is not a kind of, it's just very important that there's a kind of developmental logic, but it's not a developmental logic at the same time. It's like something that has already happened, but it is not realized. And the failure to realize it or to make space for absolute knowing or lack in one's thinking leads to various pathologies, right? In Tillich, we see the form of sexual abuse. And I think, unfortunately, this happens in religions, which we see in very problematic ways. Or it could look like rage in maybe a Dugin, or I think people, I'm not hitting on Peterson, but people will talk about a certain rage you can see versus woke, or when you're running in circles, there's a frustration that occurs. This would all be evidence of a failure to negate sublate the libidinal, and to think that, right? Now, of course, the libidinal in Dante is eros, and the argument would be that you need beauty, lack. Another thing from last week I meant to say is that the issue is that it wasn't that beauty was lost, it's that it was always lacking. So, there's this idea in psychoanalysis that there's something we lost in Eden that we lost, and like so much of the theory kind of emerges from this relationship to this loss that we need to move into lack. One could say that if we take beauty as central, you could say in a sense that Eden wasn't lost, it was just always lacking. Beauty wasn't lost, it was always lacking, but we experience that as a loss, which requires a certain realization into a lack. And you could also associate the move from religion to absolute knowing with a movement from loss to lack. And then what does that entail, right? And basically the argument is like, look, I love Tillich when he talks about courage to be. Courage is ontological. It is not merely, faith is courage, the dynamics of faith, ultimate concern, etc., so forth. But here is the massive question, and then I will give it to Mr. Jockin. All right, so Peterson says stuff like this all the time. In regard to, say, Noah, God is that which, even if you gave up religion, you would still be acting as God exists. Like, you can't escape God. Everyone has an ultimate concern, right? That's like Paul Tillich's idea. Like, you can't escape existentially acting as if God exists, even if you don't want to, right? Because God is the ultimate concern, and all beings must have an ultimate concern. I'm happy to go into detail on this. That is absolutely what Jordan Peterson thinks. When he talks about God, he is talking about the ultimate concern and the necessity of the subject to be existentially structured according to an ultimate concern. Very Tillich-like. The question is, and I would say, look, and Cadell talks about this, religion is better than suppress, that's if you're repressing on reason, with new atheism, as Cadell talks about, then you're repressing the madness innate in reason itself that's going to blow up. But then if you move to spirit without religion, there's still that individualization that's problematic. But then if you get to religion, here's the question. If Jordan Peterson's religion is the religion of ultimate concern, what is lost between that and explicit identification, say with Islam or with Christianity or with Judaism and taking a stand? What is it that occurs in the movement from that explicit identification beyond simply the existential necessity of God that sublates the libidinal that otherwise does not sublate it? What exactly occurs in that? And I think you're pointing at it, Mr. Luber, but I'll pause with that and just give it to Mr. Jockin to continue. But Mr. Jockin, please.
Yeah, on the Peterson point, I remember reading his maps of meaning years ago. It's a long text, so I don't have very high memory about it. But what stuck out to me, it was really interesting because I think the main thrust of his discussion was the existential dread of basically the Soviet Union contention with the West. So it's just interesting. So it's kind of from his origin of crisis, his whole project of maps of meaning gets articulated, and it is interesting to see kind of similarly that within this group, at least within my understanding of this group, one of our points of understanding is we're entering a state of crisis of that the organizing principles of basically the post-liberal hegemony is falling apart. It's breaking. And which was, by the way, it was almost like Peterson was aware of it. It was kind of like he was in a panic from the post-war hegemony, while we're like past the post-World War II hegemony. We're like beyond it. Yet it's like Peterson's conclusion is a symbolic non-religion. I say that because he's been asked point blank, "Are you Christian?" and he's denied it. He's obfuscated. He's not willing to identify. Yet his operations do seem like a state of the symbolic that I'm seeing, kind of this relation, and that's where he can't really land the loss into lack. There's no like he doesn't have the equipment to do it. And from my understanding, that's always what our interest in the beautiful is about. Is this this loss becomes lack when we realize there's a distinction of the beautiful and the good. If we see them as the same, then then we're just stuck in an algorithmic capture that will end up in violence. There's no way to deal with difference other than violence. How to deal with it, because any symbolic operation that's oriented towards a good, is going to end up into a contradiction. There's going to be some error that's going to have to be obfuscated, and that obfuscation, effacement, is going to eventually explode when it cannot handle the stressors anymore. I'm just saying that too because even like how Peterson did recently in that Jubilees episode, I recall seeing it. It did seem like that because it was like this kind of like response of debate, and he was floundering horrendously in it. And you could feel this kind of antagonistic force of what was going in the discourse because of his positionality he's trying to hold on to, which, again, just to close out, remember from Maps of Meaning was the post-World War II nuclear arms race Armageddon or crisis and how to respond to that. At least that's my memory from Maps of Meaning. But Dan, you can always clarify if I'm wrong about that or build on it. But just want to share that reflection point, everybody.
I think it is absolutely critical to his thinking, and I think honestly, maybe our generation it is perhaps very difficult to imagine these periods of really living in the middle of, oh, there can be a Cold War, there could be a nuclear apocalypse. Honestly, again, I speak about it all the time. I really, 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 really think it's important to study the Cuban Missile Crisis. That is what's going to get us. It's not going to be, in my opinion, a gradual buildup of armaments, World War III, and an invasion. That's always going to probably be proxy warfare, or it's going to be, it's not going to, I don't think. Now, let me pause. The caveat to this is drone ethics. Drone warfare is the unknown black swan in all of this. So, I don't know if we appreciate how dramatically warfare shifted over the last 5 months. I know, not to be political, I know they're having this big military parade in DC coming up. But I would also argue that if it's not all drones, it's not actually the military, because the military now is basically going to be one giant drone invasion fleet. You have no chance, because look how the drones are just wiping out tanks left and right, right? So, this cannot be overstated. But I do think it is more likely it is going to be something like a very sudden, out of nowhere game theory problem like Cuban Missile Crisis that people feel trapped in like a mouse in a Kafka story that's going to erupt. And basically, if we don't have the right people in the right place, say with virtue ethics in that situation to hold the geopetic together, we're in trouble. And I know you mentioned that in your talk with Javier and Michelle. Mr. Jockin, I could not agree more. The Cold War is central to Peterson's effort. And I think Dimitri has brought up something very important where Zizek's politics is thinking, and his thinking is coming out of the Cold War. And these failures that have occurred. So you have these failures of particular new political orientation that are simultaneously in the midst of nuclear threat. And it is hard in someone like, if we agree with the thesis, I do think it's hard to argue, when Harari and Homo Deus basically says the wealth and prosperity of the 90s is partly due to nuclear warfare and deterrence, which makes me think of the golden arch theory of deterrence and Friedman. Oh, okay, so you mean to tell me that the great success and wealth of the modern world is due to an apocalyptic threat? That doesn't bode too well. Let's hope that doesn't blow up. So that tension, and the other thing, so two more things I'll say on Maps of Meaning that I think is actually his best book. The first idea, to put it very simply, is that thinking is always already mapped. We are already thinking as a map. There is no thought or rationality that is isolated from a mapping of reality. So perception is always guided. It is always subjective. So basically, you can't get rid of the subject. A point Cadell makes, Zizek makes, we've all made. You can't remove the subject. That's central to Peterson. But why does he arrive at that thinking? Because he wants to know how in the world people got to the place where they're willing to literally end the world. And he goes, oh my gosh, people were willing to end the world because of disputes over identity and maps and worldviews and ways of understanding reality. Now, whether we agree with that or not, so be it. But generally, the Cold War is understood as a conflict between worldviews, capitalism, communism, whatever. Of course, everything can be more complex. But the way he's framing it is he's saying, how in the world is that people can get to the place where they're willing to literally end the world over worldviews? Well, he says it must be because worldviews are deeper to us than we realize. Like, it must be that worldviews are not just these kind of optional neat things. No, they structure our very being at the deepest root, right? And that's where he gets into hero, chaos. If we get rid of worldview, it's chaos. And basically, he would argue that our hatred of chaos is greater than our fear of death. Like, Heidegger, the idea that death is what structures us. He's like, yes, death matters and we have to confront our death. But actually, we'd rather die than it exists in a world that is unintelligible to us because our map has been torn up, or we've lost our map of meaning because it's been overturned by communism or overturned by capitalism or whatever. And that's a reason why we're willing to basically do anything to save it, right? So so you could put it this way: the Cold War is what contributes to him thinking the question of maps, because he's trying to address how is it worldviews can matter so much to people that they're willing to end the world, basically. Now, I would want to add to Mr. Peterson's analysis game theory. I would want to bring in economic trade, like there are factors I'd want to bring into it. But generally speaking, this is true. People will basically do a whole lot of terrible things in the name of preserving their worldview. They'll break up friendships, they'll leave work, they'll break marriage, they'll fight people. people will do a whole lot to preserve their quote unquote map or story, right? So Peterson is quite correct on that. The Cold War is a big thrust of his thinking, but this is where what's very interesting is if the difference between Zizek and Peterson has something to do with a movement from religion to absolute knowing, thus making lack, movement from loss to lack, then this is a very interesting comparison. And if talking about Peterson, another reason why I like to bring Paul Tillich here, and then I'll give it to Javier and Luber, is that we can also just talk about the stakes between Tillich and Zizek. What are the differences between Tillich and Zizek? And what does that leave us? And now I would have to get, I'm not sure if Tillich finished his systematic theology. One could say Tillich's God is not apophatic enough. Actually, the argument would be that there's maybe a hard split between reason and revelation in Tillich. This would get us into theology, but it is interesting to think those differences and what exactly are the stakes of it. But I will pause and I will give it to Rivera and then Mr. Luba. Rivera, thank you for being here, sir.
Yeah, no problem. Love being here. You know, I think the libido and violence question is really where the thinking is at. Like I'm starting to see now why I'm so captivated by the virtue ethics and psychoanalysis debate, because I really do feel like there's a lot that hinges on that impasse and problem, thinking through. So I'm gonna bring up Aristotle now, because I think it was interesting, and this is a conversation I had with Jockin earlier. Of Aristotle says that anger is when you're overcome by reason. And I thought that was interesting because I was thinking, what are the extreme portions of a being becoming overcome by reason? And it actually would be like something like fundamentalism. Like fundamentalism is like a kind of like hyper rational overcoming of reason, of being overcome by reason. And it makes sense that anger is one of the key features of these kind of like paradigms. And then it leads to violence. But then violence, and I know Jock is reading Girard, so it's like, it's interesting because then it's like violence can either be this point where violence becomes, and I'm just using like playing with Aristotle's framework, violence becomes actually a hyper deliberated impasse of reason, right? Violence is where reason exactly fails, precisely because we can no longer agree to a standard in which we can even deliberate about this problem anymore. Like there's nothing to deliberate about this problem. So henceforth, reason says, all right, violence. That's the only option left, violence. So violence now seems to be the impasse of reason. And so we don't have another option to that for people. There's no other option to that, it seems, which I think is interesting. And then now we have to talk about libido, now we have to talk about libido. I think this is why, Daniel, your point about non-rationality is so important, because it's like if you think only between rationality or irrational, then we're screwed. The other thing, and this is something that I was talking to Jockin about too, and this is kind of be a little bit of a sidestep, kind of more on like the whole Christianity, beauty kind of relational thing, is I was talking to Jockin, and Jockin was telling me that, Plato scholars are still saying beauty, goodness, and truth are all co-eternal, co the same. And, Jockin was basically like, yeah, they don't want to let this go because the Trinity has that kind of impact on them, right? But then I was like, they're thinking like kind of like what Luber was saying. They're thinking after the fact, because the Trinity, when it was formed, was after the fact. When did we form the Trinity? Well, when the event of the cross was the big mystery, and that was the point where they were like thinking about this relationship. So it's interesting that beauty has that movement of complete dissipation, where when beauty strikes, you have the cross, it reorders everything. So actually, when the cross happened, it reordered everything. That's when you could say that beauty, goodness, and truth were the same. Only when beauty struck that it was able to reorder it in the right alignment. But it's the aftermath that is the dangerous part. That we then just, for some reason, no longer prepare ourselves for the strike of beauty, like you talk about, Daniel. That we are now afraid, like Christian thinkers are now afraid to deviate, because they feel like they would be breaking away from the Trinity, and the Trinity is this mysterious thing. It's like, well, it's not the Trinity. You can correct me if I'm wrong. It's like, it's not the Trinity per se that's mysterious. It's the event in which they were trying to understand it, that the Trinity was created. That is mysterious. So it's interesting because to me, the Trinity is actually proof of when the beauty struck that everything became aligned and ordered. And that's how we were to understand that thing. But yeah, those are just my side comments on that.
No, I think those are lovely comments. Well, another way to kind of think about it, because I really like this idea that it is after the strike of beauty, then there is this sublation that creates this effect of equivalence, but you have to keep in mind the order that led to the strike, and then the appearance of things after the fact, right? It's that crazy move in Dante, where from the top of the Paradiso, then everything goes together, but that has to be realized from the top. And of course, it's also that where at any level that you look back, it will seem as if it's the whole, but every level entails, and you have that kind of retrospective move that occurs. I'll give it to Luber and Dimitri. Another way to look at it is you have to choose the standpoint from which you ask the question, is the true and the good and the beautiful. Are you going to ask it from the ground of good, the ground of true, or the ground of beautiful? The argument would be that if you say they're the same, you need to do it from the ground of beauty. So in a sense that the beauty is the ground by which you are asking about the identification, then yeah, from that ground, you can talk about them having an equivalence. But then the very fact that beauty has to be the ground suggests a highness to it, right? Like one of the problems is most people are now saying the good, the beautiful, and the true are equivalent from a ground of the good. They experience something good that they enjoy, and they say, oh, and it is beautiful, right? That's different from the strike of beauty, which let's just say here a mystical experience. From the mystical experience, if you say there, that's good, that's beautiful and good, that's very different from saying from an experience of the good, that's beautiful and good, right? So the ground from which one is speaking of the equivalence itself actually suggests some sort of differentiation. And one wants to be speaking about the equivalence, if one speaks about the equivalence, from the ground of the experience of the beautiful, of which then, of course, to even know, you have to meet the conditions of ever having. If you've never had the experience of the Geopedia, as y'all have talked about so well, or Holy Spirit, etc., so forth, well, then you wouldn't know what you are missing when you conflated the good, the beautiful, and the true, right? But if from a place of in the experience of the Gedopedic, if you said this is good, beautiful, and true, that's very different from the experience of simply a good time. You said that this is beautiful, good, and true. You see, like the ground on which you are speaking the thing changes the legitimacy of the thing, of the equivalence. And actually, this is very critical because something that Peterson says that's true, if said from the ground of religion, is very different if you say the exact same thing from the ground of absolute knowing. If you speak about the courage to be from the place of, say, reason or spirit or absolute knowing, that's very different from speaking of courage to be or ultimate concern from absolute knowing. Exact same concept, but from the different orientation, it changes everything. And this is why I think this is all so tricky. Because when you're dealing with quote-unquote sublation, it's not that Jordan Peterson is wrong or Paul Tillich is wrong. There is the risk of in thinking them, speaking of them from the wrong standpoint, from the wrong orientation of, say, AA versus AB, from religion versus absolute knowing. So this is what one would say. It is not that Jordan Peterson is wrong. it is that he is speaking from religion in a world of lack of absolute knowing. Therefore, what he is saying necessarily will eventually arise at an enclosure. It will close in on itself and be an internally consistent system. It must. And then when it does that, anything that is other from it must now be kept other, and it must be kept out. Well, now we have global turmoil. Now we have the makings of conflict. Now we have the makings of very problematic things, right? And so it is only the claim of absolute knowing is that it is only where lack is that you can deal with global pluralism in a way that doesn't necessarily eventually fall into World War III or violence, as Jockin has said. It is only from that standpoint. And of course, what we were saying, so Christianity spoken from religion is different from Christianity spoken at absolute knowing. Hinduism at religion, different from at absolute knowing. Islam, atheism, etc., so forth. Conservatism, liberalism, every single possible ideology is different from the orientation from which it is being spoke. And basically the claim is that it is only from an orientation of a place of lack that one can speak of any possible story and it not ultimately end up in some eventual enclosure. And that is what is so tricky. And then basically from any other orientation than absolute knowing, eventually the libidinal and the topics of psychoanalysis will come in and cause all of the trouble. Even if you are rightly oriented in your concerns, like Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson is absolutely rightly concerned about the Cold War, nuclear apocalypse, and the fights and the totalitarianism and fascism. He's absolutely right. But the great continual irony is that if you are right from the wrong orientation, you can contribute to the very thing you're trying to avoid. Because unfortunately, Jordan Peterson, in his concerns he is extremely concerned about fascism in his works, but you could unfortunately argue that if you are in religion versus absolute knowing, then thoughts about the concerns of things like fascism or totalitarianism or exactly so forth can easily be absorbed into fascist movements that even if Peterson himself would distance himself from, one cannot ignore the movements on Twitter or everything that we're seeing that unfortunately are going in a fascist direction have absorbed a lot of Jordan Peterson's thinking. He would easily say, I want nothing to do with that. And the same happens with the Counter-Enlightenment. The Counter-Enlightenment, well, my other argument is Jordan Peterson is a thinker of the Counter-Enlightenment. Absolutely. Guess what? Unfortunately, I had to acknowledge that the Counter-Enlightenment leads straight to fascism. It leads straight to Hume, and all of that goes straight into these horrific fascistic movements. Okay, you take that seriously. If you take the fact that Paul Tillich ends up in all of this womanizing, there's something wrong that has to be rethought. And that basically, as I talked about in the Science of Logic, at the class we did at Philosophy Portal, that leads to from the Scottish Enlightenment to German idealism for me. And ultimately, then in the background of all this is Balthasar, beauty, etc., so forth. I will stop, give it to Luber and Dimitri. Luber, please.
It's crazy that Paul Tillich did that to women like that. Because when you read him, like I read Courage to Be, it's definitely, you're not thinking that the author is doing stuff like that. But here's the thing with Foucault. I think when you read Foucault, you could tell because I'm pretty sure Foucault did fucked up shit too, right? Or at least there's rumors that he did pretty fucked up shit. You could kind of tell a little bit, at least from my reading, so fixated on power, like I think that what are thinkers fixated on, I think indicates something. With that said, my fixation on story, who knows what that will be looked at. Maybe they'll say I'm completely schizo, but I think so. And this just goes into this goes inside with lack very much so. If a story is for the sake of some external thing, so it's like, oh, I'm telling this story for the sake of people to know how to love someone, let's say, it's going to feel top down and it's going to feel like propaganda, and it's not really a story at that point. It's more just like a propaganda on how to love someone kind of thing. But that's the same thing with like action. If you're doing something for the sake of some external gain, then it's production, not action. That's, I think Johannes brings that out in his new book really nicely. And I think lack is only appropriately understood with action and not production, because lack in terms of production is this type of, it's a bad infinity, essentially. But so like lack on the production side gives this type of bad infinity where you always want more to produce, essentially. I am doing this to get money, but what I'm doing isn't really, I'm not doing it for the sake of doing it. I'm doing it for money. And then once that thing dries up, I'm still going to want more money. I'm still going to want more of whatever I'm trying to produce, because it's always outside of the action it's always the intention or the means is always outside the particulars of what I'm doing. So when you situate lack in terms of the actual action that you're doing, what you're realizing is lack means that the guiding action that you're undertaking you're always undertaking it in a state of becoming. And in that sense, you are lacking in fully accomplishing that action, that guiding action that you're undertaking, such that it's inexhaustible. Like you're always going to be doing actions for the sake of some guiding action that you're undertaking, and that you can never actually fully do the guiding action principle that you're operating under. And in that sense, all actions that are being that you're undertaking essentially will always be for the sake of that guiding action itself. So when that happens, that's like, to me, a genuine real story. And in that sense, you don't really care about other people's stories, because the act of caring about other people's stories means that you're just thinking about what your story is producing, and that what the other person's story is producing is a conflict with what you're producing. That's what that means. So the Cuban Missile Crisis is just a misappropriation of what the focus should be on. There's a literal I don't think you could have that kind of violence when you're just doing something for the sake of doing it, because your concern is only within your scope of what you're doing and not by some external production, which, if you're focused on an external production, you always have to compare. That's the thing. But when you're doing something for the sake of doing it, what's being compared is essentially the internal mechanisms. So it's like what's being compared is, how my action today differs from my action that I'm doing right now, or an action that I did in the past, how it's different than what I'm doing right now. It's like, oh, I'm loving my girlfriend like this on Tuesday, and then Thursday comes around and it's a different context, but I'm still operating under the same guiding action, and I do something differently that's operating under that same guiding action that my past action was doing. And that's the only appropriate comparison. And it's totally within the action itself, totally within the guiding action that you're operating under. So it's just, the real violence will become internal and not external in that sense, where you're just thinking about how to be excellent within yourself. And you're not comparing how what you think you're producing that's excellent, how that compares to some other person or other entity's production in terms of what they think is excellent. And it's like, oh, my excellent and their excellent is colliding, and fuck their excellent, because my excellent has to be the only excellent. And that's all from a productive mindset and not from an actual like ethical mindset. Like a true ethical mindset is always, the violence will always, in my mind, be internal. But so yeah, the the thinking about lack in that way is, I would say, part of thinking about situating the I can't say the word right, libidinal in its appropriate. But leave it at that. I think I got my point across.
What you were saying, Mr. Luber, I appreciate. Well, I'll give it to Dimitri. This is why intrinsic motivation, and then like Dimitri has brought up a few weeks ago, that's so important, that drive is the non-dialectical core of dialectics. Like it's the possibility of dialectics, but this is very important because based on what you're saying, basically we cannot even properly think or approach dialectics unless we have some sort of wheel turning wheel, right? This kind of self-propelling logic that is going on. That seems to be, of course, the very possibility of then creating theme. Because if we bring intrinsic motivation to all we do, they are thematically bound by that very intrinsic motivation, right? It's you're kind of bringing theme into all things. It's extremely important. So then the question is the following. All right, so Aspasia, it's wonderful to see you. I was talking about how I've gone down a really deep Jordan Peterson hole, and I'm comparing him with Paul Tillich and Real Speculations and Zizek and all this fun stuff. And next is going to be talking about technology in Peterson, because I think Jordan Peterson, the treatment of technology, I think, is very important in Peterson. But anyway, this is what I would say. If I were to offer a key critique of Peterson, that if he were to hear this, he may have a response to, and I would love to hear it, but this is what I would say. All right, so everyone knows that Mr. Peterson is very concerned about order and chaos, and mythologically, he talks a lot about the hero and the dragon. And the hero is this sort of courage to be that is going to be tied to the ability to face the unknown. Now, again, there is something dialectical in Peterson's thinking, but the argument is it a Hegelian dialectic, or is it more of just a classical dialectic? So he says things like meaning is found on the border between order and chaos. Meaning and meaning is more important than happiness, talking in maps of meaning. And so the ability to navigate the line between the known and the unknown is very important. And I would also say that there is something remarkable, like Peterson is, in my opinion, responding to the exact same things Philip Rieff is talking about. And he's going in a more Jungian direction. Now, Sam has pointed out that the way that Peterson treats Carl Jung is problematic. But if we grant what Rieff is saying, Rieff basically was saying, if we respond to the problem of the loss of givens and the unleashing of releases with Jung, everyone's going to end in their own private religion, their own private sort of religious journey. And that's going to destroy the social. And basically, that's why Rieff is like, we have to think this through Freudian and psychoanalytical thought. And then he died. And so, you know, this is very interesting because I think Jung, there's something about Jordan Peterson that is responding to the triumph of the therapeutic in the more Jungian direction, which Philip Rieff actually saw coming. And it's going to be in the mythological direction, for good and for bad. But here's the key idea. In Peterson, the heroic is going to be defined primarily as the idea of handling the dragon, as being able to deal with chaos. And certainly, the ability of the human subject to deal with chaos is absolutely necessary. And I would say that what he is describing about the relationship of the hero and the dragon is religion in the phenomenological journey, as Hegel and Cadell talk about, right? Here is the key idea. So a good hero will be able to handle the dragon, okay? In Hegel, it could actually be precisely when a hero is good, in their very good hero-ness, that a dragon appears in the hero themselves, actually. That the dragon, and this is very important. Now, Jordan Peterson all the time may say that anyone can be a monster. He knows that all of us are capable of being monsters. But here's and I think when you're talking the difference between religion and absolute knowing, the differences are very, very fine. I think they're less fine if you're comparing spirit and absolute knowing or reason and absolute knowing, but the closer you get, the differences are fine. So Jordan Peterson knows we all contain the monstrous, but here's the key. A good hero, though, in being a good hero, would not be monstrous. The argument of absolute knowing is that it's actually possible that a hero in being a good hero unleashes something monstrous. That is a result of them being a good hero, not a bad hero. In the very success of the hero, a new chaos could emerge. That's really traumatic if you take that seriously, and really difficult, but that is the truth that I think Zizek and absolute knowing is pointing to. And we can see this. So for example, Okay, you define the heroic according to the worldview of, let's just say, global capitalism. Okay, and so therefore you're able to fight the chaos of, say, societies that don't have capitalism because it's chaotic and they're not ordered. So you fight the dragon of chaos, which is the lack of global capitalism, and you're able to bring it into global markets, like Paul Planier talks about in The Great Transformation, right? Okay. But what if actually, so let's then say you succeed at bringing all nations under the logic of capital, and poverty goes down, you have a great enrichment, all the stuff Dietrich Mikowski talks about. And then it turns out that capitalism leads to a flattening that removes the dynamicism of subjectivity and turns everything into an algorithm, as Jockin and Javier were talking about, right? So the very success of the heroic capitalism against the chaos of the lack of prosperity then entails intrinsic, internal to itself, a new chaos that is actually a new dragon that is actually the algorithm. And the chaos that actually emerges is the pathology of the subject when they feel themselves being flattened by capital, but they lose the ability to talk about it because all they have at hand is algorithms that leaves in excess of the explanation for which they seek. That is an internal chaos, if you will, mental illness, etc., so forth, that is unleashed by the very heroic success of the hero against the dragon of capital. And you could make the exact same example if you were to make the hero atheism, Christianity, you name it. Every single possible hero eventually at a point will reach where a dragon actually appears because of its very success. That is the thought of absolute knowing that I would argue is not in Peterson. And that is why you're ending up with the pathologies that are being described. It is hero versus dragon, which of course is very important. But then the next step is the realization that a good hero can actually unleash a new dragon. In being good, Peterson would absolutely say if a hero is bad, you can unleash a dragon. The point that we are making, that I am making, is that a hero that when they're good can actually be the source of a dragon. And that's what I unfortunately think we see in Paul Tillich, and we see in other people who do not sublate the libidinal. And yes, it was very devastating for me to find the truths about Mr. Tillich. But I will pause and I will give it to Dimitri and hope that my internet does not die. Dimitri, please. I think I'm here. I don't know. Dimitri.
Hi, hello, Dimitri. Everyone.
Hello.
Hi. I want to. So I promised Javier. I'm sorry. I promised him that I will lambast Lacan. So I read the biography of the wife of Lacan, Sylvia Lacan. First, she was called Sylvia Bataille because her first husband was Georges Bataille. Anyway, Lacan kind of snatched her. And she was an absolutely gorgeous, beautiful, famous, highly talented actress in France. Really upcoming in the scene there. But very tragically, as soon as Lacan and her got together, she had children, and she couldn't sustain her career anymore. She was just, that identity, that part of her life was just obliterated, which is, of course, a very hard thing about motherhood for women developmentally. But when you read her biography and you read the interviews, she says that it wasn't just this, but it was also the fact that Lacan was a domestic tyrant. Literally, I'm citing her words. Lacan was a domestic tyrant, so she basically had to do everything. I don't know, maybe she was in a bad mood when she had that, but like Lacan was already dead when she had this interview, and like, what reason does she have, right, to speak so badly of him? They probably had big problems between them. That's clear. Another thing is, so World War II was, of course, very traumatic, right, for Europeans and stuff. But what was Lacan doing in World War II? He had a girlfriend, but then because of the chaos and stuff, he went to the south of France, and there he met another woman who was not his girlfriend, because he already had a girlfriend. But they did not only have sex, but she got pregnant, and she did not only get pregnant, but he went back to his girlfriend, and he told her ecstatically, from the stories that the rumor goes, that he was ecstatically telling her that he impregnated another woman, which is very insane. And he was like, if Zizek was a man of the excrement, Lacan was a man of the flatulence, right? He would fart publicly without shame, asserting his master morality through the anal drive. Yeah, but anyway, yeah. I mean, that's one way to assert that you are against closure, but I don't know if that's the right one. Damn, that's really disgusting. Now, okay, so since we're talking about real speculations, I'm gonna say this very same thing again. Philosophers really have to repeat themselves, otherwise you're lost. Artists, they also repeat themselves, but I feel like they can do it in a way that they don't say the same thing over and over again. Right? But anyway, so I'm going to repeat myself because I am a philosopher. So I'm writing an article. This article is gonna be publicized soon on Substack. It's a very long article. It's the single longest text I ever wrote, and I'm proud of it. It started as a response to Cadell's real speculations, but then it started developing and escalating, and so it's also about the topic of communism. Yeah, which is also inspired by basically what Cadell says in real speculations. And one of the points that Marx has made is that communism is absolute knowing, and this is what we get. This is after the religion moment, you get the Christian atheist moment. If, let's say, we just work with the presuppositions of Hegel and Zizek. So we get the religion moment and the Christian atheist moment as like kind of self-othered moment of absolute knowing, right? Like, it's not Daniel, from what you said, I heard in the way you described it that absolute knowing is not contextless. It's not without an absolute knowing out of which it comes, to which it responds, right? It's a certain, so yeah, there's a Christian context, of course, here in Europe, but then I mean, introduction of critique of philosophy of right by Marx was really going against Christianity. He said, it's so weird, so when you read philosophy, really like put attention to those little things in the first sentences. In this first sentence of the introduction to the critique of the philosophy of right, Marx says the critique of religion has been completed. It's easy to gloss over it, but it's like, what wait, like what? Is that really okay? But that was really like something that Marx kind of assumed. It was a kind of working presupposition of the communist movement. Yeah, it's literally the very first sentence. It's literally, or maybe the second or something. So, but yeah, no, I mean, I think we can say this is just wrong. This is just wrong, right? Anyway, so I do think when I think about communism, yes, I'm a communist. Nail me to the cross, please, because I do think. Okay, so in Cadell's lecture, in the Marx course, he was saying that Cadell, he has a certain unease about the term communism, and I understand it because, like, why would anyone call themselves communist today? Which is really the reason that Zizek does it. Zizek's very adamant, like, I'm not a socialist. He's also not a communitarian or a communist or a ultra-leftist radicalitarian or intersectionalist sublationism. It's communism. Like, it's in your face. It's like, troops, Red Army, invasion of Berlin type stuff. That's what we think, gulags, But, I mean, we all know the first one to go to the gulag in communism would be Zizek. Right? It would be an honor if we could join him. If we were good enough Marxists, we might. But I'm not so sure yet. I'm not so sure. I'm trying to live up to it, though. I really take Zizek's communism hyper seriously. I think we should. I think we all like to strawman these thinkers. I mean, just today I'm kind of reading about economy and stuff, and I like Keynes a lot. Aggregate demand. Of course, you can't look over it, but when people in economic disciplines talk about Marx, it's like it's an exception when it's not a straw man. It's an exception when it's not a straw man. Like von Mises, I don't know if you guys heard him. I this is one of the guys I was reading, but he's like, I read his book on Marx, and I was, I don't know, it wasn't good at all. But yeah, we don't have to do that, we can choose just to take what the thinker said and be like, wait, but let's just sit with it. Like, it's actually very weird to say that the critique of religion has been completed. Like, what's happening there? We don't have to strawman Marx Marx for that. And I want to read, because I'm trying to open the rift. It's communism. Is it really the closure of the rift between the reproduction of the species and the reproduction of capital? I mean, yeah, in a way, that is the ultimate goal of the communist revolution. Like, we're literally like going extinct with not only the AI thing, but also like just falling birth rates, right? Like, we're kind of headed towards collapse. So a communist revolution would be about like, do we have to like keep sacrificing our subjectivity on the altar of capital circulation, or can we actually have some kind of reproduction of the species? It's a good question anyway. I think that's the communist question. So Amadeo Bordiga is a famous left communist, founder of the Italian Communist Party, and he was the last person to critique Stalin in his face. I believe it was at the end of the 20s or at the beginning of the 30s. So, of course, the Soviet Union was ruled by the Bolshevik Party, but the Bolsheviks themselves were members of the Third International, right? Which is the international body, like a federative body of communist parties, which is supposedly the highest authority, right? Why would any national authority be the highest authority? It's about communism is universal, right? It's not about particular national identities. So Bordiga actually proposed that the Soviet Union wasn't going to be ruled by the Bolsheviks, but that the Soviet Union should be ruled by the Third International, and it should be ruled by all the communists in the whole world, because that would be really a communist move, right? That would really show, like, are you guys honest? So, of course, they didn't do that. Bordiga was kicked out of the party. He was called a Trotskyist. He was not a Trotskyist. And, Bordiga, he saw himself as a Leninist, but Bordiga, if he had one critique of Lenin, it would be that Lenin was too democratic. Lenin was too democratic. One of the famous Leninist concepts, is democratic centralism, which is the idea that we come together, we deliberate in a democratic manner. But if the majority, 51% says we go left, we don't go right, or we go right, we don't go left, everyone has to like enact it without questioning, just go for it. That's democratic centralism. And Bordiga, he was not into that. He was into organic centralism. Now, I will read to you a passage. If you think communists are totalitarian, let's see how you think about him now. But I'll read to you a passage by Bordiga. So, communists have no codified constitutions to propose. They have a world of lies and constitutions crystallized in the law and in the force of the dominant class to crush. They know that only a revolutionary and totalitarian apparatus of force and power, which excludes no means, will be able to prevent the infamous relics of a barbarous epoch from rising again. Only it will be able to prevent the monster of social privilege, craving for revenge and servitude, from raising its head again and hurling for thousandth time its deceitful cry of freedom. Now, talking about violence, this is kind of crazy, but okay, I want to put one more point. I know I'm talking a lot, but so Italy, okay, the word fascism comes from Italy, of course. That's where the fascists really first got into power, right? Early 20s. How did they get into power? Like, Italy had a big communist party, it was nothing to scoff at. They were at the factories, there were big labor unions. So, according to Bordiga, the founder of this Italian Communist Party, what happened was that the Communist Party chose to go through to a parliamentarian route, to unite with the Social Democrats and to go for a reformist route. What happened is that the fascists and the Social Democrats and the center kind of got into power, and of course later the fascists, just kind of like got power without much resistance from the center and the left. Meanwhile, the communists, they had no guns, they had no nothing, because they chose to go parliamentarian. Now, if the communists would have not gone to this parliamentarian route, but would have actually stayed in the factory, would have kept, or today I think it's harder to conceive of a non-parliamentarian politics, but back in the day it was totally different. Parliamentary was not. It wasn't this social media thing and it wasn't voting. Wasn't this like big commercial campaign? With it wasn't this big national thing. It wasn't like a certain bourgeois instrument of like deliberative power, right? Like balancing different demands and stuff. Anyway, back in the day, the communists in Italy chose to go to the parliamentarian route. That was a big reason why fascists had it quite easy to get into power in Italy. And if that wouldn't have been the case, maybe we wouldn't have fascism in Italy. This is, it's crazy. Like, this is really like the thing about democracy is that it seems like more and more, and I will take the US as an example because we're most familiar with that. We're heading to like a non-democratic point within democracy that we'll see like, okay, but hey, Bernie and stuff, you guys are calling it an oligarchy, and Trump, hey, you guys are calling it like a fake, not really democratic thing. So both parties are calling themselves actually representing a non-democratic apparatus, right? Well, so how is this going to develop? Well, at a certain point, they are going to have to stop talking because they're going to have to apply violence. I don't know. It's a real scenario, It's a real scenario that could, that will or could erupt. I don't want to say too much about it, but yeah, that's violence. So that's just.
Oh, it's a time. It's a time. I appreciate everything you laid out there. I think you're covering some very important points. And I did not know about that with the Italy fascists. That's fascinating. So thank you for sharing that. A few things that come to mind. I think indeed the question of the reproduction of the social and the question of must we keep sacrificing our subjectivity to capitalism, or is it possible to imagine subjectivity not being so sacrificed, right? Well, a few things is one, we ourselves have to be able to handle subjectivity, not sacrificed, a non-flattened subjectivity, which means we have to handle the horror and difficulty and negativity of ourselves, and we have to be able to handle other human beings that have a higher complexity and dynamicism and fullness, right? Half the time human beings, when they ask one another, how's your day going? They don't actually want an answer. Imagine a world where people actually had answers and they were not predictable and they were full, and you would actually have to really pay attention, right? That would be an energy demand that people don't want to use, right? So there are certain demands this would put on us. Mr. Jockin, thank you for being here, and I'll give it to Mr. Luber. So that's absolutely right. And part of the problem becomes is we've also been sacrificing our subjectivity so long and flattening it that you get habituated to that, you get comfortable to it, and then if you wanted to shift it, it would be very difficult. And Aspasia and I, with Tim, we were talking about that at Voicecraft the other day, where there's something about capitalism that wants to remove the complexity of the subject, because then actually you have less complex markets. I think we were talking about this last week. So it's easier to sell to people, right? So you want a certain flattening to occur. The problem is we as human beings can actually enjoy being flattened because we can enjoy the simplicity that follows, the understanding that comes, and so we come to like it. And that makes sense because it's the pleasure principle. There's a pleasure in understanding. There's actually a pleasure in this flattening because everything is very straightforward and it goes from there, right? You brought up von Mises, and I'll just touch on him to suggest, I think, some of the problems that have arisen for our current moment. So Mr. Mises, at the beginning of Human Action, really wants to argue for free markets from first principles. Like the very way that human beings just act in isolation. Basically, he wants to show that if you just take a human being and you place them in a state of nature, that free markets will arise. Like that's kind of the project of Human Action, to really say that capitalism is axiomatic, that it is fundamentally grounded, and therefore anything that is not capitalism goes against human nature itself. Now, that's very simplistic, but that is the effort of autonomous rationality, to show that that is the effort of von Mises, which basically is an effort of autonomous rationality. I kind of showed my hand there, to show that if you let rationality be rational, it will arise at free markets. Now, the ultimate critique for me of the idea of free markets, and Cornel West has said this and other people have said, is that there actually have never been free markets. They have never existed. They have always been a thought experiment. Every market has always been a mixed market. That the market and the state have always already been in bed together. And the great thinker of this is Paul Planier. He points out that the moment you have international trade agreements, you need a state and you need a military to watch over it. So international trade, by definition, means you can't be dealing with free markets. He also goes into an elaborate... Please.
I think, okay, I agree with this point. Of course, it's never like abstractly, totally free. That's like as if it's a vacuum. But I really wonder how you would think, like, isn't the Hegelian approach to such a thing that, yes, it's not really abstractly free, but the abstract universal is concrete in the fact that it is a presupposition, right? Like, if you listen to entrepreneurs and how these people talk, they are constantly presupposing the freedom of the market. So yes, it's not real because it's way more complex, but at the same time, it's a fundamental presupposition that keeps the mechanism afloat.
Yes. So my response, that's a very good point. So the issue that I'm ultimately going to say is that free markets basically require the subjectivity of people in free markets to maintain it. But in von Mises, free markets are a system that keep themselves free without government intervention. So this is the problem, is that if free markets are not free, it must be because of intervention, because the free markets are such that they will naturally converge on free markets. My argument is that free markets are only maintained as such if the people in the free markets keep them as such. If they maintain free market, but here's the problem, there is always, this is the main issue, there is actually always an incentive in free markets to move toward mixed markets. If you as a corporation can get in bed with the government, you beat everyone else. And of course, what is fascism? Fascism, from an economic standpoint, not a nationalist standpoint, is where you have a free market, but the winner gets state power. This is very important. You have national champions, I think they call them in China. The Chinese economy is fascist. It is not communist. And so the key is, in this sense, the very rationality of wanting to make profits will actually compel people in a free market to seek to turn it into a mixed market, because the ultimate way you get profits is to become invincible and to become married to the state. So the only way to stop that is if the subjects in the free market themselves just basically say, no, you cannot do that. That's not allowed, right? They have to maintain the abstract ideal as subjects on the level of the subjects to themselves. But this is the mistake, in my opinion, of von Mises and other Austrian thinkers, is they basically say free markets are a system that keep themselves free by their own rationality unless the government intervenes. Right? That is the axiomatic mistake. This is the point. To just sum it all up, and there's a key paper in Second Thoughts called The Rationality of Self-Destruction that tries to go into detail on the logic of markets are always rational and why that actually naturally, by the very consistency of free markets, lead to mixed markets. So that's in Second Thoughts. I'm happy to go more into it. But the point is this. Free markets are only free markets contingently. Okay? So it's contingent. All right. Well, basically what I'm about to say is communism is no different. The very maintaining of communism is contingent on the subjects. It does not, the mistake of communism is to assume it doesn't become Stalinism. Like, you hear basically the discourse about communism when people are talking about the fall, they're like, well, Stalinism is not true communism. That's not it. Well, it's like libertarians talking about the free markets. Well, this isn't true capitalism. It's the government has gotten involved. Right? There is no system that automatically works. It is always going to come down to the contingency of the people in the system to maintain it or not. And the key idea is the number one test for maintaining it is the response to the surprise of the other, the trauma, the negativity, the difficulty, the encounter. And when you find out people are actually different, that is the challenge of both free markets and of communism that we haven't thought. And again, what Javier and Michelle were talking about is geopedia. This is basically Holy Spirit, as Cadell was saying. It will all come down to us as subjects being able to hold that And we haven't. So if we haven't, then free markets aren't going to save us, and communism ain't going to save us, because communism will become quote unquote Stalinism and free markets will become mixed markets. It's not going to matter. So basically, the giant argument of belonging again is you pick whatever system you want. It will depend on a subject. It will depend on a human element that can never be systemized. That's the Gödel point. Every possible way of creating society will always depend on a Gödel point that is the subject, the lack that is the subject, and it will all come down to what they do or don't do in light of the other. And that requires work that we haven't put in and we haven't even thought, but we're having to think now. More can be said, but I will give it to Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber, please.
That was so good, Daniel. Yeah, it's I've been closely following, I would say, your work for over 3 years now, and it's interesting how I've heard all this before, because like I listen to your videos, read, the shit, blah blah blah, but it's crazy how I just want to make this quick remark and then go into a more of a response. But it's crazy how I can hear the same thing essentially like 10 times, and then on the 11th time I get like a different thought. It's like it blows my mind how it's just, of course it's like it's contingent on the subject, and that's the Gödel point, and when you get there, how it just a flood of possible things and thoughts occur, and every time you arrive at that thought, it's always an explosion of possible, I don't want to say solutions, but possible responses. And then, yeah, it's just, I mean, my mind, and then I've had this thought so many times where it's just like, okay, the way you think, the way the responses come to you you tend to respond to those responses in a way that you want to make it universal. Like that's the urge. That's like the itch. And I'm like, I feel like every week I just want to scratch that itch, but there is no one way. And then when you realize that there is no one way, what is the best response but a response that's like a very, very, it's a framing, not an actual direct response. That's the trick. And that's why like I love, if you had a, I forget when you said it, but like if I had to label myself, I'm a literature guy, like I really think in the times that we have right now, literature guy, storyteller guy, because like when you say literature or story, all of these things are subsumed in that. Like there's so much that's already subsumed in thinking about, just use my language, and just thinking about story essentially. And what's interesting is at a certain point, if that becomes the paradigm, eventually it will become self-effacing once again. And then maybe in the future it would be like, everyone says they're, a storyteller. Well, I'm actually a philosopher. And in that sense, it holds a different lack of rigidness, let's say, that it does hold in today's world context. Just using that as a crude example. But I think the key to respond more directly to what you're saying, I think, yes, we need to think about the subject and the individual, but I think the real move is creating spaces where you're not creating this certain kind of subject, but it's more about you're creating a certain kind of group. Because I think the irony is that society has been trying to create a certain kind of subject in such a way that it destroys how the subject is realized within a group setting. And with the algorithm aspect to it all, what the group setting becomes homogenized into one algorithm, where we could say, oh, I know people have seen this meme. Like, the fact that that's a reality is so scary. Or like the fact that, like, oh, there's this like big TV show now, and if I were to go out and socialize, like, it's almost like a given that everyone has to talk about that one show that's out right now. And basically it's destroying the ability to have a real group, where a real group is like in the artistic world. I think when you make real art, it's not made for everyone, but the way the algorithm is, it needs to be made for everyone. It is made for everyone. And in the act of participating in something that's not made for everyone, but you feel like it belongs to you, generates a group that has a clear finite limit to it. And the algorithm essentially destroys this more subject-based limit, where it's all subjects have to watch this one show. All subjects are, recycle this one meme, so to speak. And the real like, you can't resolve this difference here, what I'm about to say, and to me that's the real problem, which is doing anything money related will always be a means of production, and therefore it will never ever allow for a group to actually just be a group and not homogenize into one group for all kind of thing. Like,
what about the Communist Party?
But this is what I really have in mind. The Communist Party is just another it's a reaction. And correct me if I'm wrong. Like, I read El Capital in college, but I'm talking 10 years ago now. But even the Communist Party is a mode of production. It's not like you're participating in a. Okay. So even the Communist Party would fall prey to what I'm saying, because it's for the sake of producing some product that is beyond just the individual. So you're taking the individual, and the individual is reconfigured in a way that the actions are for the sake of the state, essentially. That all actions are for the sake of the state. And since it does that, it's basically taking money is essentially translated for being, a willful participant of the state. It's not for being it's not for being sake. That's the thing. Like, that's how tricky. It's so simple in a certain way. It's like you have to be for being sake, and the second you say I'm being for something outside of being sake, it's immediately a mode of production, and basically different forms of homogenation will occur, and you won't be able to have a genuine subject and therefore a genuine group for that subject to emerge in. That would be my clarification thing, but please jump in.
Luber, I really like your thoughts here, and I do want to be careful though, but because on the one hand, I think that some people who strawman Marx just pretend that communism is just the state is totalitarian and takes everything over, but there's a truth to that. There's a truth to that. There's a truth to the fact that Marx Marxism and Marxists have really been focused on state power, dictatorship of the proletariat as the true tipping point, and that should be the Northern Star of the party. And this is actually one of the things that I'm critiquing in my article. I'm going against. I'm actually going against the notion of the dictatorship of the proletariat. At least as Marx conceives of it in more writings, like Critique of the Gotha Program, Communist Manifesto. There's different ones. So yeah, and another thing, Andrew, is that for Marx, there's two stages of subsumption. Like the way that capitalism comes about is by subsuming labor, right? So first, capital for Marx subsumes labor, not by changing labor itself, but extending the working day so that more commodities can be sold of the market to accumulate capital, right? Like there's a farmer, and instead of producing for subsistence, the farmer works and works for capital circulation. So then there's real subsumption, and Marx, the most simple way to define real subsumption would be that capital itself starts to subsume the very form of the labor process, which it introduces machinery. So it doesn't just extend the working day, but it changes the way work is done. But also another facet of real subsumption is that it is production for production's sake. And the funny thing is that as soon as Marx says that real subsumption is production for production's sake, he also says, well, actually, you could also say that this is also the case in formal subsumption, which would be the subsumption before real subsumption. But the question is, I think you're right on it. Like the question is how, like, can we conceive of like a way of being or a community, or it's like family, community, state, to echo Hegel's triad of the ethical system. Can we conceive of ways of life, really? But like, communal ways of life, collective ways of life, grounded in contingent singularity, that do not get this type of perverted mechanism? Like, is it always just going to be like production for production's sake, capital for capital's sake, the state for the sake of the state? You see what I'm going at? Like, because the thing is, and I think the proletariat is like, I think it's a great notion. I disagree with a lot of ways it's being used a lot by Marxists, but one of the great things about proletarian subjectivity is that a proletarian subject is never included in the discourse. The proletarian subject is always left out of the discourse. For example, what is bourgeois life? Well, it's basically the American dream. Get a suburban home, get a car, get two cars, and all of this. But then a proletarian subject, it's like, yeah, you got to go to uni to do that type of stuff, right? But then it's like, yeah, but what if you don't have rich parents? Well, then you got to go into debt. Well, but you don't really talk about that, do you know? Like, and these are all things that, like, they're so deeply repressed, right? Like, just like the fact that, I was talking to someone and she told me that for her birthday, she got a car from her father. And I was like, wow, that's okay. That's great. And then immediately it dawned on me, like, oh, you are getting a car for your birthday because your parents also paid for your driver's license. Like, it wouldn't be sense for my parents to give me a car, not that they have the money, but it wouldn't make sense because I don't even have a driver's license, because they also don't have the means to just pay that for me, right? So it's like, but we don't talk about those type of things. So it's like, I mean, I've been at these points of life that I've been feeling so guilty or shameful, like thinking to myself, why can't I basically live according to that normal bourgeois life that I see a lot of other people doing, But then again, it's not on me, right? It's a taboo that's generalized. But this is what I mean by proletarian subjectivity, right? Like, it's like you are expected to go along with that bourgeois life because, of course, we have a free market, we have free individuality, we have all these things, right? It's like all meritocratic, supposedly. But because there's always a mismatch in that discourse, because as soon as you enter that discourse, you're alienated from yourself, right? Like as soon as if I would like pretend that I can just, I don't know, yeah, I mean, if I can just, I can't pretend that there's things that I don't get that other people do get, which is included in the normal life of like higher education and stuff like this, right? And I don't want to make it about me, but I just want to give myself as an example of like, you know, what's the proletariat? The proletariat is a citizen who doesn't have property, which is an oxymoron. In the Roman days, this is where it comes from. It's an oxymoron. It's an anomaly. But in capitalism, it's like an anomaly that is really about the most people. Like most people are the anomaly, right? They're not full citizens in that sense. Even though in our constitution, everyone is a citizen, right? Everyone has all these beautiful liberal rights, which are great, and we should have that, right? That's what communism is all about. Like having that is great, and we should raise ourselves. Can we raise ourselves to really actualize them on a more radical basis? But then that's where all the problems of violence actually begin, because this is it's not just funny dreaming. Anyway, I'll stop it there.
So you just inspire me. You just inspired a thought. So like, basically, I'll use a personal example and then apply it to like my relationships on the net and that kind of stuff. But basically, when I am writing a story, there's already agreed upon theme that when we're ideating, essentially, that I might not agree with somebody, but the level, the intensity of that disagreement isn't super intense because we already agree on a certain theme, essentially. So basically, like when I'm shooting the shit with, like, for example, Daniel, who's a Christian, I'm not, you know, I'm sure at a fundamental level, there's a disagreement, but we kind of already agree on the theme. And that's why it doesn't feel, at least for me, like very touchy, raw. Like it doesn't feel this way. It only feels very raw, or you get this emotional reaction when there's disagreement that emerges when a theme isn't agreed upon. That's essentially, so like just to like give an example, like I think the Geopedia and algorithm dichotomy is great because I think it gives a really good theme, which is like we kind of all agree on, don't let the algorithm change your Geopedia. Like it's that's what's at stake. That I would say is like the command, so to speak. So it's like you're a Hegelian. I fucking love Heidegger. You know, Daniel loves all of them, and there's like, you know, Jockin likes Aristotle, kind of hates psychoanalysts. Not actually, but just the sentiment, you know. But the reason why we're able to talk, even though we have these particular existential beliefs and things that we hold. I don't even want to say beliefs, things that we hold. We could talk about it and still be together because we all kind of agreed that we shouldn't let the algorithm change our Geopedia. Like at the end of the day, like I really do think people don't take story seriously, and when you take story seriously, you realize basically disagreement comes down to when people aren't clear on their thematic position and there's a disagreement, or they flat out don't agree on the theme and they have particular things that they hold that they disagree. Those are all conflict comes down to those two things, I would say, like very dogmatically. Like I would love to hear, and I'm all ears, just an example of conflict where that isn't the case, essentially. Because I can, maybe forgive is the wrong word here, but it's like, you know, let's say I don't take Jesus into my heart, but a Christian does, and they're able to forgive what I hold more readily simply because they know that we're thematically aligned. Like that it's so simple. It's actually insane when you think about it, because you just have to talk about, okay, what are the stakes of your existence? What is the stakes of your existence? Basically, talk about that. Then from there, talk about what you hold. You know, oh well, I'm Jewish. Oh, I'm Christian. Doesn't it matters that there's that difference, because it just shows how complex, you know, like one stance on a theme is, basically. But it doesn't really matter that you do disagree. It just shows how, yeah, this theme of not letting the algorithm change the Geopedia, it affects the human condition. Like, not it affects, it touches on the human condition in so many different ways that it needs to be the case that I'm Jewish, you're Christian, I hold this, you hold that, and yet we both agree on the theme. Like, it's a necessary part of it. Otherwise, it really wouldn't be a theme at all. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of bring my own way of thinking, because I think what you were just saying, like, circles this very much so when you're talking about Marxism like this. I'm walking around outside. I wish I was taking notes, because you did say something that I'm like directly responding to, but I forget. But I'll pass it off. There's so many comments I got to read.
I think I love this idea of watching you walking and you're writing, you're putting it up on film posts and writing it like electric wires. You're like, hey, can you park your car? Can you park your car so I can write on the hood? I love that image. That's just fantastic. So a few things. Basically, the critique I am suggesting of a Tillich and a Peterson and others who are stuck on religion. Dimitri, good to see you, sir. Thank you for coming by. I love what you shared. Is that basically there was a lack of resources for establishing a theme across global pluralism in a manner that would allow a theme to be held that is clear, or a theme that would allow people to agree. So stuck in religion, you can't establish that theme, and as a result, you must end up enclosed. And as you end up enclosed, you get all sorts of pathologies and problems, right? But then, of course, the way that you maintain having enough consistency to have intelligibility and nevertheless have an opening, an open circle, an open system, is it has to be at a girdle point, which means it has to be at the subject. And the only way to do that is to make the subject be that AB, where hero and dragon are together, where it is not hero and dragon against one another, and it has to be in the subject themselves. And that means you have to face the complexity of the subject, as Aspasia has talked about, versus think of the subject as complicated. So, and Clayton, good to see you, sir. Ultimately, in order to make sure you don't have an enclosure that becomes politically consequential or removes the possibility of finding a theme across global pluralism that can help us be geopedic, is that you have to have an open circle. And that means you have to have every system entail complexity versus be complicated, as Aspasia has talked about. And complexity is that of which you can't predict, you can only be prepared for. It is that which gives you emergent results that have to be participated in to be known. It's going to be tied far more to story. And of course, it will be a girdle point where you can't have correspondence and coherence. You have to exist in the suspension and then nevertheless function. That's a very high ask, but basically, if you do not, you're going to be in trouble. And also, someone may hear everything I just said and said, well, that's your opinion. And this is why arguments of which help make lack justified versus asserted, which can be found in Aristotle, which can be found in psychoanalysis, which can be found in various thinkers, Beauty, Aquinas, etc. That's why that's very important, because that would give oomph to the belief that every system, every map entails a girdle point, which is extremely necessary to overcome this very incredible problem. Mr. Luber.
Sorry, can I jump in real quick?
Please, of course. You can roll in. You can't jump. You have to roll. Like literally on the sidewalk. Turn the camera on. I want to see it. I want to somersault in. Yeah, there it is. Here it is. Here it is. Oh, he's going to do it. Here it goes. Roll, roll, roll. Oh, yeah. Oh, wow. You're going to die. Come on, I want to see it. You have to roll in. Okay, now you can go. Thank you, Luber.
Okay.
You're allowed. That is fantastic. Thank you, Mr. Luber.
Okay. Yes, yes. And that is all. No. I actually want to disagree with a minor. It's not. It's something minor in what you were saying, but it's very major, I think, in the position. I don't think it's an opinion. That's like, I get why someone could say that, but if you just take a second, basically what you're saying, like a proper conversation to me should start at what in your mind, what are the stakes? Like that simple, because I think basically the conversation should start on where the stakes, how one articulates the stakes, and whether they agree or disagree with each other's stakes in their mind, essentially. But because what I do think will happen is most people, I would venture to say everyone would agree that the stakes are algorithm versus Geopedia. Like, that's how I think that is like the theme of our time. Like, when this concept came to me in this position, I was like, this is the theme. This is it. Like, I have not been able to articulate it, but like, I don't see anyone who could push back saying that isn't the stakes. Like, I think it's a fact. Like, that would be my bold claim. I think themes are facts. That would be my claim, which is very, very intrusive, because I'm basically assuming in a very dogmatic way what other people in their mind, what is at stake. And I think it's honestly, the irony is we'll probably need a strong man, that figure, to take that theme seriously and to dogmatically assert it onto everybody like a tyrant. And for that to be what gets us out of being primarily in an algorithmic mode. And even the way I just stumbled, like I said that word, it's a certain myth. Like, it's a type of, like, that's why I think it's actually okay to be dogmatic and to say it like a matter of fact, and not that it's an opinion, because at the end of the day, it's more in the mythos dimension. But yeah, it all does come down to AA versus AB. Exactly. And basically being able to realize a set of stakes, essentially, that allows you to think in terms, or not think, but to be in terms of an AB and not an AA. So like, if you're thinking about stakes where it's like, oh, there's nothing I can do, there is no other, you're essentially an AA. Your very being is an AA, which isn't a theme at all, which isn't a story at all, which means you're just basically MCU. Is that the right term, where it's basically you're just like the bot in the video game, the guy at the counter that like is fixed to say the same thing every time. And NPC, yeah, NPC. Bad with words and stuff, but thank you. You're basically an NPC if you realize your stakes, where it's like, oh, there's nothing I can do, then you're an NPC. And that's why I would venture to say, like, you're really stating a fact and not something that I think is an opinion, which is like, I think a whole argument in itself right there. But sorry, I just had to roll in and say that.
I don't disagree at all. It is that the AI calls are going to be AA versus AB. Belonging again talks about rhetoric versus discourse, voicecraft versus Kafka likeness, which is all algorithm versus Geopedia, algebra versus geometry. Those are absolutely 100% what it all comes down to. I suppose what I meant when I was saying is people would claim that what you're saying is opinion. And one of the reasons you turn to the resources of Aristotle, you turn to philosophy or psychoanalysis or everything that we're talking about, is precisely to show that it is more than mere opinion, that actually these are the stakes. But you see, here's the problem. I completely agree, but we also have to do the work of actually bringing people to the place where they can see that or get it, right? And this is where the skills of oration or therapy or story or these skills or the book on beauty is bringing people to the place where they can see that of which seems to be opinion is actually that of which necessarily must be the stakes, right? And that, I think, is that's part of the trick, right? Because actually, unfortunately, as we learned from Mr. Dostoevsky's Underground Man, even someone faced with 2 + 2 = 4 can just say, I deny it. I don't want to accept it, right? They can willingly just ignore it, right? And problematically in the world, you also have to account for the person that doesn't want to listen or has political or economic incentive not to listen, or all of these people that would say it's a false choice because the algorithm is going to give us the transhumanist, we're going to have a transcendence of the human condition and we don't need to worry about the problem of AA versus AB. Because actually the algorithm will, in its very success, take care of the problem for us, right? And I think that's actually, in my opinion, the main problem we have. Is that people think the problem is going to be transcended by the very success of the algorithm that will actually enable human beings to transcend the nature, if you will, of which entails a fundamental lack to one that doesn't have to account for it, say in virtual reality or some sort of mode of being that helps us stay in the positivity without dealing with that. So you could have a future. Unfortunately, to me, the problem is people are going to be tempted to cover over AB. It's not that it's not going to change the ontological problem that you're describing, Mr. Luber, but you could imagine, unfortunately, 100 years or a catastrophe or something where people are able to put off to great consequence facing the stakes of this problem. And I suppose that's more of what concerns me, is I do think we, unfortunately, in our freedom, have a choice on when we face the inevitable. The inevitable could be 10 years, it could be 100 years, it could be tomorrow, right? Just because something is fundamental does not mean the facing of it must be immediate. That's up to us. And basically my argument would be the longer we put off thinking the problem of AA versus AB, the greater the consequences in a very bad way so be. So in a sense, perhaps the opinion rests in the realm of timing. It rests in the realm of what can keep people putting off what needs to be thought and the consequences that would come from there. But I don't disagree with the point that you're making. The stakes are the algorithm versus the geopedia, the voicecraft versus the Kafka likeness, et cetera, so forth. But of course, another reason why beauty is so critical to all of this is that beauty overcomes opinion with the strike of beauty. It demands a response that you can no longer reduce to the algorithm. So if you can increase the probability that the average person can experience beauty, then you greatly increase the probability that people do not delay experiencing or accepting the stakes of the moment as you. Mr. Luber, good to see you, sir. Thank you for being here. So the strike of beauty is important to actually move people beyond thinking of opinion. But of course, as Mr. Jockin may point out, when the beautiful and the good are collapsed together, then this has to stay in the realm of opinion. So the ability of moving it beyond to where it is realized that what is being said is not mere opinion requires the work of increasing the probability that people experience the beautiful. They have the geopedic, they are in spaces of voicecraft, they're able to have the geometric, et cetera, so forth, which then, of course, that's part of the work of what we are doing. I'll say a few more things, and if anyone has final things to say, please. I think also what I would say on what was being said on production is that in a very real sense, yes, the question we have is, must all use of money end up in a production? I think there's a question of the difference between production and investment. And is it possible to have investment that is not reducible to a simple production? And I would say investment in spaces do that. When you invest in a space or an incubator and you don't have a preset idea of the kind of subjects that people become, instead what you're trying to do is create a condition that increases the probability that the person involved becomes definitively themselves versus a preset idea, then that may be a way to avoid the problem of necessarily using money toward a production. because what you're doing is using money as an investment for an incubator, and the outcome is not known. The goal is simply the making people more fully themselves. You know, Rookmacher once said of Christianity, Jesus did not come to make people Christian, he came to make them fully human. I think we can take that logic and say perhaps money can be used in a manner to invest in spaces that incubate within people a greater probability that they become themselves than otherwise. And of course, this will all be predicated upon the separation of the good and the beautiful, and thinking that. The other thing I was going to say on what Dimitri was saying on communism, so there's state communism, there is more anarchist communism. You could talk about federalism. Good to see you, Aspasia. Thank you for being here. You can talk about small government. There is a category of thought that I think is getting at perhaps a non-state communism without realizing it, that's federalistic, communitarianism as a political philosophy, which I do basically think is what communism is if it doesn't become Stalinism. But of course, the critique of communitarianism is it's not individualism, it's critiquing individualism. It wants to talk about the community, but here's the issue. Communitarianism is itself because it has norms. It has an idea of the good that the community is trying to realize. Well, of course, then we're in Foucault. Of course, then we're in the risk of oppression and so on and so forth. But to say something very large that would have to be elaborated on, what if we were to think a communitarianism of the beautiful instead of the good? A communitarianism where the community is organized around a strike of beauty and the open-ended results of which that could give rise to, which can only be seen as a making of the general definitive, then this may overcome some of the problems of communitarianism in the past. And basically, if I were to close, I would say that Jordan Peterson in religion gives us a communitarianism of the good. He's not a simplistic individualist. I think that's wrong, even if ultimately he must fall back into something more individualist. It's very clear to me that Peterson is trying, like the Counter-Enlightenment, to think communities that are like communitarianism. And in that sense, it's a blend of the communistic and the market. But it's a communitarianism necessarily of a shared good. A communitarianism, and thus religion, and thus the pathologies of not sublating into absolute knowing. And that's probably going to look like unsublated libidinal, which will look like probably violence or sexual abuse or things like that. What we need is a communitarianism of the beautiful. And that's going to require the essentialization of lack, and then thinking what it means that lack is not nothing. We've not had a political philosophy that is communitarianism of the beautiful, and that may be the address of our current historical moment. But I'll run. Thank you all for being here. I've enjoyed it immensely. Clayton, thank you for coming by. Always a pleasure. Michelle, of course. And thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. All the best.